The key lay in Grace Turner's hand. Small, cold, unbelievable. She turned it slowly, her thumb brushing the ridges as if they might whisper the reason it was hers. They didn't. It was just metal, ordinary in every way, except that it had come from him. From Richard Hale, the man whose signature sealed million-dollar contracts, whose decisions shaped lives far beyond hers. And yet tonight, he had placed this in her palm without a word. Janitors didn't get keys from CEOs. Not like this. Not when most people in the building barely looked at her twice, let alone spoke her name. She was 28, cleaning the offices where empires were built, forgotten as quickly as the dust she swept away. She wasn't supposed to be here, holding something that belonged to his world. Grace had handled countless keys in her job: office doors, supply closets, equipment cabinets. They all opened places that didn't matter. But this one felt different. It wasn't just about a lock. It carried a weight she couldn't name, a question she wasn't sure she wanted answered. She remembered the moment clearly. Richard Hale hadn't smiled, hadn't explained. He'd simply looked at her, steady, deliberate, and pressed the key into her hand as though he already knew what he was asking of her. He was never careless. A man like him didn't survive in boardrooms by being reckless. If he had chosen her, there was a reason. But why her? The thought echoed louder than her heartbeat. She wasn't powerful. She wasn't important. She was just Grace Turner, a woman mopping floors and fixing what others broke, invisible in the shine of glass towers. And yet this single key made her feel the ground shifting beneath her feet. It wasn't the steel that unsettled her. It was what it meant. Somewhere a door had been drawn between his world and hers, and he had handed her the choice to cross it. The world before this moment was gone. She knew it in the way her hand trembled, in the silence that seemed too heavy for the night. Grace Turner was still a janitor tonight, but tomorrow would not look the same. And so, the story must be told. To understand this key, we must go back to the beginning, where it all started. Grace Turner lived in the quiet corners of life, where no spotlight ever reached. Her world began when the office lights dimmed and the suits went home, their voices still echoing faintly down the marble halls. She would slip in after them, mop in hand, her footsteps the only ones left to walk the polished floors. At 28, she had long since grown used to being unseen. Most people never glanced her way, and those who did saw only the uniform, the name tag, the cart that squeaked faintly when she pushed it from one office to the next. They didn't see the woman who carried books in her bag, who hummed softly to herself as she worked, who remembered the dreams she once had before bills and responsibilities pushed them aside. She wasn't bitter. Life had taught her to move quietly, to find strength in small victories. An extra shift that paid rent on time, a broken pipe fixed before morning meetings, a coffee stain erased as though it had never been there. Invisible work, invisible worth. But even in invisibility, Grace carried a resilience others missed. There were nights when she paused by the tall windows and let her eyes wander to the city below. The skyline glittered with possibilities she didn't believe belonged to her. And yet, some stubborn part of her wondered what it would be like to stand where decisions shaped futures, instead of cleaning the aftermath of them. Her coworkers called her reliable. 10 years younger than most of them, she rarely spoke, and when she did, her voice was soft enough to pass unnoticed. The few who remembered her name often forgot it again within days. She didn't fight it. She wasn't one to demand attention. But in her silence lived a willpower that life hadn't broken. Grace endured because she had no choice, and in that endurance was strength she didn't yet realize. No one in the building thought of her as more than the janitor who kept things running smoothly in the shadows. No one, except him, Richard Hale. And though she didn't know it yet, his gaze would alter the course of her life. Richard Hale was a man who filled every room he entered. At 55, he carried the kind of presence built from decades of command, shoulders squared, voice steady, eyes sharp enough to silence an entire boardroom without raising his tone. To the world, he was the model of success. A self-made CEO whose name appeared in magazines, whose decisions moved markets, whose signature alone could determine whether hundreds of jobs lived or vanished. Yet beneath the polish of power, Richard carried something quieter. A loneliness that followed him long after the meetings ended, when the lights dimmed in his office and the city below sparkled without him. His empire had cost him more than time and energy. It had cost him pieces of himself, friendships neglected, family ties frayed, a personal life that had withered under the weight of ambition. He was respected, He was admired, but he was not known. In the sterile rhythm of corporate life, most people blurred together, offering him handshakes, flattery, or fear. Few dared to meet his gaze without agenda. But there was one face in the building that asked for nothing, a face that bent quietly over a mop bucket, that lingered long after others had gone home. Grace Turner. He had noticed her long before she realized it. Not because she tried to stand out, but because she didn't. While others scrambled for his approval, she moved through the building with a kind of honesty that struck him as rare. She never sought attention, yet her quiet resilience spoke louder than the rehearsed voices that filled his days. Sometimes, in the late hours, he would pass her in the hallway. She would look up, startled, perhaps expecting indifference, but he would nod. Just a nod. It wasn't much, but it was the beginning of something unspoken. Richard Hale didn't often allow himself to wonder about the lives of those around him. But with her, he found himself pausing, noticing, respecting. She was invisible to everyone else, yet to him she had become impossible to overlook. And so the threads began to weave together. The powerful CEO and the janitor nobody noticed. The night it began was nothing special, at least not at first. Grace Turner was bent over a stubborn stain in one of the conference rooms, her rag working in circles against the polished wood. The building had long since emptied. The echo of laughter, of footsteps, of hurried phone calls had faded into silence. It was just her and the low hum of the air system. She didn't hear him come in. She never expected him to. Richard Hale didn't belong in late-night conference rooms when his car was usually waiting downstairs, his schedule carved with precision. Yet when she looked up, there he was, standing in the doorway. For a moment her chest tightened. She half expected him to frown, to ask why she was still there, to remind her of her place. But he didn't. His gaze wasn't sharp with impatience, nor cold with authority. It was searching. Long night? His voice was low, even, carrying none of the weight it usually bore in boardrooms. Grace blinked, uncertain he was even speaking to her. Just part of the job, sir. Most CEOs would have nodded and left. That's what she expected. Instead, Richard stepped further into the room, his eyes lingering not on the stain she scrubbed, but on her. You've been here a while, haven't you? She froze, rag still in her hand. No one asked her that. Not the other staff, not the managers, not even the people whose offices she cleaned every night. They spoke about her, not to her. I suppose, she answered carefully, unsure if honesty was welcome. It pays the bills. Something flickered across his face, not judgment, not pity, but recognition, as though he understood more than her words gave away. That was the first time Richard Hale spoke to Grace Turner as though she were more than a uniform in the corner of his empire. And for her, it was the first time she realized the most powerful man in the building not only saw her, but listened. It wasn't long. Barely a few sentences exchanged before silence reclaimed the room. Yet for both of them that small moment was different. It lodged itself deep, unshakable, as though the air had shifted. A CEO had spoken to a janitor, not with commands, not with indifference, but with curiosity, and Grace would never forget it. It happened on an evening like any other. The building was quiet, the hum of machines and faint buzz of lights the only companions Grace Turner had as she worked. She had just finished stacking cleaning supplies back onto her cart when she saw him again. Richard Hale. He stood at the end of the hallway, his figure tall, deliberate, framed against the glass wall that overlooked the city. He wasn't supposed to be there. Not at that hour. Not without the chorus of assistants and advisors that usually surrounded him. Yet he lingered, as though waiting. Grace hesitated, her hands stilling against the handle of her cart. Part of her thought she should turn away, move quickly, stay invisible like always. But before she could retreat, he stepped forward. There were no speeches, no explanations. Richard reached into his pocket, pulled out a single key, and placed it in her hand. The cold metal pressed against her skin, heavier than its size could explain. She looked up, startled, searching his face for meaning. His eyes held her steadily, calm but unreadable. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He simply looked at her, as if to say the key itself was the message. Her breath caught. Sir, what is this? Richard's gaze didn't waver. He gave a slight shake of his head, the kind that silenced questions before they were asked. You'll know when the time is right. His tone wasn't commanding. It was steady, almost gentle, yet final. And just like that, he turned and walked away, leaving her with the weight of a secret she had never asked to carry. Grace stared at the key in her palm. It wasn't labeled, it wasn't marked, just an ordinary piece of silver, yet her heart raced as though it were something more. Why her? Why trust the janitor no one noticed with something that clearly mattered? Her fingers closed tightly around it. This was not just a tool for a door. This was something larger. A test, a trust, a threshold. She didn't yet know what it opened, but she knew her life had just been changed. It didn't take long for the building to notice. Places like this always noticed. Grace Turner tried to carry on as if nothing had changed. She still clocked in quietly, pushed her cart down the hallways, scrubbed and polished in silence. The key never left her pocket, its outline pressing against the fabric like a hidden truth she couldn't ignore. She hadn't used it yet, but even in her stillness, the world around her shifted. Whispers began in break rooms, carried on the edges of coffee cups and hurried glances. Why does she walk around like that? Did you see her near his office last night? What would Hale want with her? It was strange, almost cruel, how quickly people began to care about the woman they had never seen before. The same colleagues who had passed her 100 times without recognition now spoke her name with suspicion, as if her very existence had changed. Rumors grew. Some said Richard Hale had a weakness for her. Others claimed she was holding on to something secret. Some leverage no one else understood. A few even whispered scandal, though they had no proof, only the unease of seeing lines blurred that were never meant to cross. Grace felt it in the stares that lingered too long, in the sudden silence that followed her when she entered a room. She wanted to tell them they were wrong, that she didn't understand it any more than they did. But what good would words do? They wouldn't believe her. And Richard? He said nothing. He walked the halls with the same composure, the same steady authority, never acknowledging the rumors that spread like wildfire. If they reached his ears, he gave no sign. His silence only deepened the mystery. For Grace, the pressure built with each passing day. The key was no longer just a question in her pocket. It was a shadow, changing how the world looked at her, how she looked at herself. She hadn't turned it yet, but already, doors were opening. Doors of judgment, of curiosity, of fear. And once opened, those doors could never be closed again. For days, the key burned in Grace's pocket like a secret she wasn't sure she wanted. She carried it through her shifts, feeling its weight with every step, as though it pulled her toward something inevitable. She told herself not to use it. She told herself it wasn't her place. But curiosity, heavy as the silence around her, grew stronger each night. Finally, one late evening, when the building lay in its usual emptiness, she stopped resisting. The key slid into a lock she had passed 100 times, a door tucked away at the end of a quiet corridor few people noticed. It wasn't labeled. It wasn't part of her cleaning route. She had walked by it so many times without thought. Now, her hand trembled as she turned the key. The door opened with a soft click, not into another office or a storage closet, but into a room that felt untouched. It was nothing like the sterile, polished spaces she cleaned every night. The air was softer here, carrying the faint scent of old wood and leather. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled not with company reports but with journals, faded volumes, and photographs framed in quiet reverence. A heavy desk sat near the window, but it was not cluttered with contracts or laptops. Instead, it held personal letters, mementos, and a single lamp casting a warm glow. Grace stepped inside, her breath catching. This wasn't a place of business. This was a place of memory. On the wall hung photographs of Richard Hale, not the CEO in headlines, but the man before it all. Younger, smiling, standing beside people she didn't recognize. Family, perhaps, friends long gone. Some images looked decades old, the edges yellowed with time. Every object in the room spoke of trust. He had never shown this side of himself to anyone in the building, perhaps not in years. Yet now she stood inside it, uninvited, but chosen. The realization sank deep. The key was not about access to power or money. It was access to him, to the part of Richard Hale that the world never saw. Grace closed the door gently behind her, her heart pounding. Whatever this was, whatever it meant, her life had just stepped across a line that could never be walked back. Grace Turner sat in the quiet of that hidden room long after the door had closed behind her. The lamp on the desk gave off a soft golden light, and in it she saw pieces of a man she had never expected to know. Not Richard Hale, the CEO who signed papers worth millions, but Richard Hale, the human being who once laughed with friends, who once held on to family, who once lived outside of the empire he now commanded. The room was private in a way no office could ever be. Each photograph, each letter, each object on the shelves carried weight. They were fragments of a story he had chosen to keep locked away until he handed her the key. and now she had to decide what to do with it. The key wasn't simply permission, it was trust. A trust she hadn't earned, yet one he had given her freely. She could leave now, pretend she had never turned the lock, return to her quiet life where no one noticed her. No one would know. The whispers would fade eventually. The world would forget she had ever mattered. Or she could stay. She could carry this trust, fragile and powerful, and step into something she didn't fully understand. But that meant risk. Risk of being judged, of being seen, of being tied to a man whose world was far larger than hers. Her chest tightened as she ran her fingers over a framed photo on the desk. A younger Richard stood beside a woman with kind eyes, their smiles unguarded, untouched by the hardness that success would later carve into him. Grace didn't know who the woman was, but she understood what the photo meant. This room wasn't just memory. It was vulnerability. He had chosen her, out of everyone in the building, to carry it. The decision pressed against her like a weight far heavier than the key itself. Would she walk back into invisibility, or step forward into a truth that could change both of them? Grace closed her hand around the key again, her heart steady but uncertain. She knew one thing: whatever choice she made, tomorrow would not belong to silence anymore. Secrets never stay hidden long, not in buildings made of glass. Grace Turner tried to continue as before, mopping, sweeping, carrying her cart through the endless corridors. But something had shifted. People noticed now. They watched her with quiet suspicion, eyes sharp as if they might catch her in the act of something unspeakable. The whispers that once fluttered softly in corners had hardened into open stares. She heard fragments as she passed. She's always near his office. A janitor, of all people? Why would Richard Hale bother with her? The words carried more sting than she wanted to admit. For years she had been invisible. Now suddenly, she was too visible. And Richard? He did nothing to quiet the storm. If anything, his silence fueled it. He still nodded to her in the halls, still passed her with the same calm acknowledgement as before. He didn't avoid her. He didn't explain. To him, it seemed, the opinions of others carried no weight. But to her, they pressed heavy, turning each shift into a gauntlet of judgment. The collision came fully one afternoon, when she found herself cornered in the staff lounge by two coworkers. Their words weren't cruel on the surface, but the edges cut deep. You must have something on him. Did he promise you a promotion? A favor? Their smirks made clear what they really meant. Grace said nothing. She simply gathered her things and walked out. But their laughter followed her down the hall like a stain she couldn't scrub clean. By the time she reached the end of her shift, she understood. Whatever this bond between her and Richard Hale was, the world outside wouldn't allow it quietly. That evening, as she left the building, she glanced up at the top floor where his office light still glowed. It was strange how one man's trust could open not only a door, but a flood of judgment she had never invited. Two worlds had collided, hers of shadows and silence, his of power and scrutiny. And somewhere in the impact, a path was forming that neither of them could step away from. In the end, it was never about the key itself. Not really. Grace Turner carried it still, tucked safely in her pocket, though by now she knew exactly what it opened. It wasn't just a lock on a hidden door, or access to a private room filled with memory and truth. It was a passage into something larger, into a bond that defied the lines the world had drawn between them. The rumors hadn't stopped. If anything, they grew sharper with time. Some looked at her with envy, others with contempt. A janitor, they whispered, had no place in the life of a man like Richard Hale. But what they never understood was that he hadn't given her wealth or power or title. What he had given her was trust, and that trust had changed her. She was no longer the woman who drifted unnoticed through the corridors. She walked with a steadiness now, not because she sought to prove anything to them, but because she knew what she carried inside mattered more than their judgment. Richard remained the same in the eyes of the world, commanding, successful, untouchable. But Grace had seen behind that image. She had stepped into the space where his loneliness lived, where his memories lingered, where his humanity was laid bare. And in doing so, she understood that power without connection was only another kind of emptiness. They didn't declare anything aloud. There were no speeches, no promises made in defiance of the whispers. But in the quiet exchanges, the nods in the hall, the steady glance that lingered a little longer, the truth lived. The key had opened more than a door. It had opened a future neither of them expected. A future not bound by titles or roles, but by a shared recognition that they had found in each other something rare. And so Grace Turner's story no longer belonged to invisibility. It belonged to the space between two worlds, bridged by a simple piece of silver that changed everything, forever. Sometimes life changes not with thunder or fanfare, but with something as small as a key pressed into a hand. For Grace Turner, it wasn't just a piece of silver. It was a doorway into trust, into recognition, into a future she never imagined. And maybe that's the quiet truth we often forget, that the smallest gifts can open the largest worlds. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Share in the comments what moment in Grace Turner's journey moved you the most. And if you were listening closely, you might notice how often Grace Turner's name came up. Drop your answer in the comments. We may feature your name in a shout-out as a thank you for being part of our Fiction Echoes family. If you enjoy meaningful stories like this one, the next chapter is already waiting. Just click the video that's about to appear, and we'll see you there. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a moment of what happens next.